All right, cool. So today we're going to continue our React series. This will be part 4, so we're going to focus on writing methods, where to do them, how to do that, and handling events. So the most common would, of course, be like a click event, but as there are many different types of events in sort of vanilla JavaScript, if you will, there are many types of events in React as well. So we'll be working with onClick today, or a click event, show you how that's done. You can translate that knowledge into just about any other type of event as well. So our objectives for today are to write methods and pass them to components. That will play in a little bit with some more discussion of state, props, kind of the stuff that we've been practicing with already. We'll go over how to attach event handlers to JSX elements. So whereas you're maybe used to doing document.addEventList or element.addEventListener and sort of controlling all that event stuff separate from your HTML code. In React, where we have JSX, we're sort of mixing HTML and JavaScript together. So we do that event handling a little bit differently in JavaScript. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion on where to control state and why. I know that we're really working with one state for this application. It is possible to have more than one state, but we'll talk about why it's important to have at least one sort of main place where a state lives. Cool. Any questions on objectives before we start? All right, let's get into it. So first, I want to recap a little bit where we were. I'm just going to delete these open tabs. So we have our app.js file, and in fact, I'm going to make sure that my app is running. It is running, so I've got it open in my browser here. Here's the app kind of in the state that we left it. We wired it up. Yeah, question?
I downloaded your repo. That's not what I have.
Okay, were you here when I was talking about grabbing code from the repo that I pushed?
Are you talking about Thursday?
No. So if you're not up to date right now, you can check out Denver Students. I've slacked out the repo and the branch that we're working off of right now. So if you click that link, it'll open the repo in the browser.
And that is what I downloaded that.
Last time, or just now. If you switch to the branch part 4 start, so if you go to your CLI and you do a git checkout part 4 start, that should take you to the branch which should have updated code. We can touch base on that in a minute if that doesn't work for you. So we have our app. We essentially loaded a bunch of data with our componented mount lifecycle hook in our app.js file here. Loaded it up, set it on state as our GIFs for today, and then we pass them down throughout our component hierarchy. Let's take a quick look at the hierarchy again. So we have app.js here. We made a fetch call. I can probably draw that in elsewhere. We made a fetch call to our API. Data came back. We set it on state, and that let us pass pieces of that state around. So our paragraph and our header components were receiving one part of state. The paragraphs are receiving this content array. The header's just receiving the title. And then the GIFs get passed down to the GIF list, and then all the way down to the GIFs themselves. But first, in the GIF list, if you'll recall, we mapped, right? We created this constant called GIF components and basically turned our array of JSON data into an array of JSX components, of GIF components very specifically. And then we simply rendered them within a div. So that kind of got us to the current state of our app, which is reloading quite a bit here. So we have all of our GIFs. We've gotten them from the back end. They're a little messy right now. So first thing I want to do is just kind of tighten up some CSS a little bit. So if we go to app.css, actually first in the GIF list, what I'd like to get to is just a single column with all the GIFs displaying. So I think the quickest and easiest way to do that is to give this div that's holding all of the GIFs a class name and do some styling on it. So I don't think I've mentioned this. You've probably seen it in some of the code, but in React, class is a special reserved keyword because we're dealing with actual JavaScript classes, like in app.js, where we have our class right here. So when you set class names, like HTML classes, you do need to call them class name, camel case. I'll zoom that in a little bit. It's just so React doesn't get confused. So we'll do class name, and let's just call this gif-container. And I'm going to open up my app.css file. So this is where we can write styles for the whole of our application. We'll just make a new line here. Let's do .gif-container. And I'm just going to do display flex. We'll do flex direction column so that they line up. And let's see what happens. Hard refresh. All right, so they are in a column, but they are stretched out and kind of nasty looking. So let's make one more class now. Well, we don't need to make another class. We can do child selector, right? So we can do GIF container, arrow, image, because all the GIFs are just image tags, right? If we open up GIF, all it's returning is an image with the appropriate URL. So we can do GIF container with the child of image, and let's give them a width. They can control their own height, but let's give them a width, a fixed width. We'll do 500 pixels. That should help. Yep, now they're kind of back in ratio, but they're all to the left. And so one last thing I'll do, let's add an align items to our flex container, and we'll do center. Nice, that looks a lot better. A lot more like they might display in a real application. And then just for a little extra, let's do margin on the let's just do margin of 0.5 EM. That should give them a little bit of spacing. Yeah, a little bit of spacing in between them. Nice. Cool.
Can you just go back to GIF super quick?
Yes. Yeah, class name GIF-container on the div that's just holding all of those rendered images.
Where'd you add the image?
Oh, that was in the CSS. So
Just in the CSS.
just in the CSF. So GIF container with direct children that are images.
Cool.
Yep. And I'll Slack this code actually in case anyone needs it. Cool. So what we're going to do today is we're going to make it so that if you click on, we're going to do two things actually. We're going to wire our app up so we have a counter at the top that keeps track of how many GIFs we have displayed on the page. And then we're going to write a method, and that makes it so that when we click on a GIF, it'll delete it. It'll be removed from the list. So first thing is the counter. So what I'd ultimately like is just kind of where we have these paragraphs or in addition to them, right at the top of the app, if you will, just a little counter that just says like number of GIFs and then lists the number, but does it in a dynamic way. So that number will be coming, it won't be coming from the API, but it'll be working off of the actual data that we have. So when we delete a gist, or excuse me, when we delete a GIF, we should see that counter updating in real time. So this is going to, we'll get to learn a little bit more about state and why it's important to have it in one place. We'll also learn about some of the benefits that these front-end frameworks can do for us without us having to do quite so much work. So first thing I'd like you all to do is, well, let's get back to app.js, not app.css. So what I'd like you to do is write a small component. You can get some of your setup with copy-paste off of the GIF component or the GIF list component, but basically write a component that, call it GIF counter. Make sure to start with a capital. So you'll be making a new file. Let's get it started together. We'll do GIF counter.js, or GIF, yeah, GIF counter, sure. And I'm just going to copy what I had in GIF, the GIF component, excuse me. We'll get rid of this comment here. And let's edit the name so we're exporting what we want, not GIF list, GIF counter. So this will take in some props, and let's just call the property that it'll inherit count. So I'm just going to make a little comment. It'll have props.count. That'll be a thing available here. And instead of returning an image, set it up so that it returns maybe like an H2 that has the count pumped in dynamically. We'll Once you have that component written, go ahead and render it in app.js. So you'll need to import it and then render it down in the render function. And you can put it right above paragraphs. We'll say count here. It's not going to like that comment, actually. Count goes there. And for right now, you can just pass it a hard-coded count. That was a lot of words. Any questions on what I'm asking you to do?
Yeah, sorry, I'm probably zoned out pretty hard. Can you just summarize what you want us to do?
Yeah, so create a component called GIF count that takes in a count prop, renders it in an H2 or an H1, a paragraph, whatever you want, a text element, and that displays it on the page at the top of the app.
And what are we counting the number of GIFs?
Counting the number of GIFs, don't worry about that right now. Just put a hard-coded number in there as the prop for now. You can do like 4 or 5. And we're going to make it dynamic together. I'm going to put 4 minutes on the board. And we can always go less or more as needed. So work on creating this GIF count or GIF counter component. Were you able to get the? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Cool.
Oh, do it.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, you've got exactly the right one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But when you're in app or this .js file,
Yeah.
that you're saying, well, that's where you're going to that's the content. So you know number one. Yeah. Like you're like doing this on importing out like whatever it's doing. Yeah. Those components have children. So you have like children, you guys follow we have a folder which represents the file.
Yeah, there's no notice. So, or is it a distinction between functional components and class components? But yeah, just call it.
About 10 seconds or so to wrap up. How's the time? More time? Is this about right? We can figure it out together. Okay. Cool. All right. Fortunately, it didn't beep. Nice. So, who can help me construct this component now? Yeah, give it a shot. Let's do the first part. What's the first thing or two I need to do?
In JFCounter.js.
Yeah, in JFCounter.js.
So instead of like image source, blah blah blah,
Yeah.
I just did open H2.
Whoops. I'm going to enable the React IntelliSense on this. That'll help. H2.
And then inside H2 I did props.jfcount.
Cool. Props.jfcount.
And then over in yes.
Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to stop you there. Perfect.
Okay.
Someone from the back left table, can you help me with the next piece? So we have this GIF counter. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I would say import it at the very top.
Okay.
So import GIF counter from GIF counter.
Nice. Got it.
And then you'll need to add it to your return.
Yeah. We'll need to add it to the return of the render function.
So I just wasn't sure where we were going to put it. I guess wherever you have it.
Yeah. We'll put it right below the title. So it'll be one of the prominent things that we see. So GIF counter. And that is kind of the basic render. Somebody else help me with props now. Because this component is now expecting a GIF count to come through. But right now we're not passing it anything. So what's the last piece of the puzzle here? Yeah, Austin.
So after this, you can pass this vectors, or yeah, this vectors, and I call that count.
Count. All right, I'm just going to keep rolling with GIF count. But you are exactly right. And so we'll pass it this dot state dot GIF count. And then so I'm going to do this a slightly different way. You're exactly right. You're all exactly right, actually. This is exactly what I was looking for. For right now, I'm just going to hard code 5. That's what I meant by hard code, literally just putting a number in there. But we are going to be tying this value to a property on state. So let's see what we get right now. We go back to the app, do a hard refresh, and we have 5 right here. That's cool. I think I'm going to modify the counter to say number of GIFs and a colon, and then pump it in. So let's see what that gives us. Cool. That's a little more little less of just a number that's floating on the page and something more meaningful to us. So, whoops, Command-S'ing too much here. So now let's make this dynamic. Does anyone have a thought on how we could, just based on the data that, let me get back to app.js. Just based on the data that we have available on state right now, can anyone think of a way that we could make this number dynamic so that if our array of GIFs changes, then what's displayed on the in the counter changes? Method we could map over it. What were you going to say? Yeah, dot length. We're going to do sort of ultimately kind of a combination. So in the case of just displaying the raw number, the length property of the array is perfect, right? Because it's really easy to access. We don't need to do any iteration to find out how many there are, although that would potentially work. So inside of our render, instead of this hard-coded 5, let's do this dot state dot gifs dot length. Oftentimes, I will declare a constant like const gif count equals this dot state dot gifs dot length, and then pass the constant in. I usually do this more if like I'm seeing a lot of this dot blah 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 in my render, and I just think it could be cleaner. This is not a necessary step to do it this way, but I'm going to leave it like this for now, right? So you can just pump values directly in like that. So we'll leave that. And now, when we go back to the page, I'm going to do a hard refresh just to make sure. Oh, looks like it's working now. Sweet. So it's tracking the number that we have in this array. And in fact, you can see on initial page load, we had that 0 in there. This is another reason why it actually is important in some cases to basically set up your initial state, because if we didn't have an empty array there, then we'd be trying to access a nested property that doesn't exist, and we would get an error and our app would break. We'll talk more about other ways to account for asynchronous behavior in React and in front-end frameworks, but for right now, one first good step is to at least declare initial state. Cool. So let's also now add to our component hierarchy, because we got a little more going on. We now have, I'll just copy one of these. And in fact, I'll move header over, make some room for GIF count, and we'll tie that to, come on, we'll tie that to app.js as well. So it's receiving part of the state. Basically, all of our components are now receiving part of the state. So next step, if we check our objectives, get back to that README. So we want to work on writing methods and passing them to components. And this is where things start to get a little more confusing, and where understanding state and where state should live becomes even more important. So I'm just going to run you through an example of how this works. We'll kind of write it together, and then we can discuss it and why this works. So I'm going to go back to app.js for a very important reason. So ultimately, the functionality that we want is to click on a single GIF component and have it just disappear, have it be deleted, essentially. But where does the data live? Where does this GIF actually live in our application? In app.js, exactly. So if we want to modify the array that's on app.js, sure, we're passing it around, but we're just passing references to it. It lives in our app.js state. Again, app.js being like the heart of our application, in this particular application at least. So if we want to be able to change state in app.js, even from a child component, we need to write the method, the function that's going to be able to modify state where state lives. So we need to write this method within app.js. No, good guess, but no. What we're going to do is we're going to declare another method, kind of like the lifecycle hooks. But fortunately, we can write our own methods in React as well. Now, there's a few ways of doing it, like syntactically. The key concept is that we need to bind this function to this particular class. We need to set the context. We need to set the this value for this method. There's a couple ways of doing it. In the documentation, you're going to see it done a lot in the constructor. We don't really, geez, why does that keep happening? We don't really have a constructor, but remember when I was showing you constructor, man, struggling. So if we had a constructor function, it would look something like this. This is probably what you're seeing in documentation. This dot state equals an object. And then you may see something like this dot, and we're going to call this function delete GIF, equals this dot delete GIF dot bind this. So that's a bunch of syntax. And what it's saying is this would be if we had a function or a method called like delete GIF, and we had it written sort of as a regular function, kind of like component did mount, without the function keyword, but basically a regular function declaration. So you'll see this in docs and in Stack Overflow and stuff all the time, where all of the custom methods that have been written for this class are bound in the constructor. And it's simply saying that if you use this, the this keyword within this function, it's referring to this particular class, this object, the app.js class. Another way of writing this syntactically that I prefer, takes advantage of ES6, is we can do delete GIF equals parameters fat arrow function. It's like a variable, it's like a equivalent of doing like const or var delete GIF equals if you've ever seen syntax like that. Function expression versus a function declaration. So when we write it like this, the fat arrow, I don't know if any of you run into issues with fat arrows messing up this references, but when you write a fat arrow function, it automatically binds the context for you. That's the bottom line. There are differences in this syntactically. What they're doing is just binding, so setting the this value of this function. So I'm going to delete the constructor stuff. I just wanted to show you that you'll probably see this in documentation. They're accomplishing the same exact thing. So, and the reason why this is so important is because ultimately we're going to want this delete GIF function to modify GIF's array on state, and then set state with new array GIF removed. So we're going to need to perform some logic to change the array while keeping in mind that we can't access it directly, right? So we're going to change it in some way, and then we're going to call this .set state. And this .set state is only going to work properly if this function knows what this is, what the context is. It's hard to talk about this without saying the word this. This is, yeah, it's a tricky thing to wrap your head around, but what this enables is we can now pass this function, this method, anywhere in our application we want. It can be called anywhere in the application that it's been passed through props, just like any regular data. But when it actually fires, it's essentially firing up here so it can change this state that we have. Can I get a quick fist of 5 on how comfortable you feel about this binding thing? It's tricky, and we're going to practice. Okay, cool. We're going to move on for right now. We can circle back to that at the end of this lesson, at the beginning of next one. I think it makes more sense when you actually do it. So I'm going to get rid of this .set state for now. And ultimately, first thing I really want to accomplish is just logging hey from delete. So we now, get ready for your minds to be blown if you didn't know this already, we can now pass this method around our application. Just like we can pass our GIFs array and our title and our content for the paragraphs, we can now pass this method anywhere we want. So where do we need it to get to if we look at our hierarchy? Zoom this out a little bit. We have it in app.js right now. I think GIF itself makes the most sense. So we'll pass it down to GIF list first, and then from GIF list, we'll pass it to GIF. So let's see it in action. We'll find the render. So GIF list is receiving GIFs, right, the array. And now that we have multiple properties, I'm going to go ahead and break this onto a new line just for readability. I'll tab this one over a little bit too. And what do we call the method? Delete GIF. So we're going to do delete GIF equals, and then how can we get a reference to it? We've used this .state, we've used this .props. Yes, exactly, this .delete GIF. So we're referring to, and we don't invoke it. We don't want to invoke it because then the function's going to run every time things get rendered. So this, again, refers to the whole class that we're working with. So it refers to basically all of app.js, essentially. And then delete GIF is a method. So it's a function that's just attached to an object, or a class in this case. So we use this to refer to the whole class, .delete GIF to reference the actual function. And you don't technically have to like shadow the names here, or mirror the names. I highly recommend doing so because it can get very confused. It's confusing enough. It can get a lot more confusing when you're changing your function's names as you pass it around. So what I'd like you to do, actually, you know what? Let's just do this together. Let's go down to GIF list now. And it's now receiving this function as part of props, this method. And so let's modify the GIF component that we're returning in our map. Again, I'm going to break these onto multiple lines for readability. And again, we'll do delete GIF equals, nope, not this. How do we reference it now from within this component?
It's got props that
Well, we're in a functional component, so we don't have to use the this keyword. Yeah, props.delete GIF. Cool. Zoom in. Yeah. So we have our GIF list. Make a little space here. Passing the key, the unique identifier, the GIF URL, and the delete GIF function. And then now, whoop, I need to bring back this structure for a sec. Now, within gif.js, we should have access to it. So if we log props.delete GIF, we should, when we go back over to our app, I may have some other console logs in here. Let's see. We'll refresh it. And we see 10 logs, which makes sense because we have 10 GIFs on the page currently. And we actually see like the text of our function right now. So it's making it all the way down, which is excellent. What I'd like, so ultimately, we have some functionality now. We're moving towards what we want. Let's check our README again. So that's the essence of writing methods and passing them components. It can get a little more complex when you need to pass arguments back to the function and pass them back up. There are a couple different ways of handling those, which we may get to. But the next thing is attaching event handlers to JSX elements. So for this one, I'd like you to open up this link on handling events. Go ahead and paste it in right here. And go ahead and just read this first part. Actually, how long is this? Yeah, read the first part up to passing arguments to event handlers. There's some code samples, there's some text explanation. I think that this will reveal how to do the essence of this. So let's do 3 minutes for reading, and then we'll construct the actual handler together. About 30 seconds or so left for reading. All right, we're at time. So, who can help me attach this event handler now? We're in gif.js. We've verified that this component has access to our delete GIF function, our delete GIF method. So, what's the next step to actually getting this event on the page? Awesome. Yeah, on click. In a way, it's like even easier than doing it in vanilla. We can essentially just write on our elements. I'll zoom this in a little bit more. Right on our elements themselves, we can do on click equals, and then because we're in React, we're going to open up our braces as usual, and we need our reference to the method. So that would be props. In fact, I'll just copy it from right here. We'll do props.delete GIF. And let's see what happens now if we go back to our application. We go back to the app. I'm going to do a hard refresh, make sure we have the latest. Actually, we're probably not going to see. Actually, do we have a console log in the method? Forget. Yeah, we do. We do. Okay, cool. So now if we click, yeah, for each element that we click on, we get this nice hey from delete. Sweet. So we've got everything wired up architecturally, which is super, super important, right? Now we're not just passing data around our hierarchy, we're actually passing some methods around as well, which enables us to make our app a whole heck of a lot more dynamic. So let's get back to the code. Now we need to perform some logic here. Oh, I think they also mention in the documentation, they talk about the binding, right? So they do mention also that there's some experimental syntax using this function name equals fat arrow. Since we're using the create React app script to start our app, we can do that. As I mentioned, you're going to see a lot of this dot method name equals this dot method name dot bind this, because that's sort of the tried and true way of handling that binding. But I really like the clean syntax of writing methods like this. So that's a personal thing. Some of that's up to you. And I think they also mention here in the docs that you will have the event captured by default. I'm not sure if they actually mentioned that, but just like we use event.prevent default a lot in Vanilla.js, we do often need to prevent default actions in React as well. Not so much with click events, but with form events, which is something we'll get into probably tomorrow. So, but one nice thing about declaring things like this, and again, you don't want to invoke it down here because that's going to call the method every time you get it rendered. So even though we don't have access to like parameter/function block right here, if in app.js, if we click back over there and we declare the event as like a parameter, or we can now log the event itself as well. So this is what will allow us, if we need to prevent default, right? So we don't really need to with a click event. We'll just put it there anyways. It's usually a good practice to prevent default action when you're handling events in JavaScript. So we should see now a log of the actual event in addition to hello. Yeah. So we've captured the event. So if you need the event.target, if you need any of those event attributes, or if you just need to prevent default action, that's one way you can handle it. Sweet. So let's make this do something a lot more interesting than just log stuff and prevent default actions. What I'd like to do is get to this pseudocode here. So we'll modify our GIFs array on state, and then we'll set state with the new array. So if we're going to work with that GIFs array, I'm just going to declare a constant. We'll just work on this together. We'll declare a constant. I'm going to call it GIF. Or you know what? I'm going to call it current GIFs and set it equal to this dot state dot GIFs. So this will always be reflected with the most current thing on state. Next step is we need to modify. We need to pull something out of that array. We need to delete something. There are definitely a few different ways we could approach this. Does anyone have a thought as to one way that could work? Austin. We could splice. That's one option. We could splice. Can anyone think of another way we could approach? Filter, unshift. So unshift would work perfect if it were the last. Wait, I always confuse. Yeah, that would pop the first thing off the array, right? So that would be great if all we wanted to do was remove from the front, or we could pop with the back. I heard filter, I think, from Austin. So filter is, I think, the cleanest way we could handle this. Because if we're splicing, if it's from the middle, we're going to have to get its index, and that can get a little messy. Filter can do a lot of heavy lifting for us as long as we have something to compare against. And so we'll roll with filter. And another thing that's nice, well, we'll roll with filter, but we do need to modify what this method is receiving so that it can get something that we can use, right? Something that we can use to filter out the array. Because for filter to work, we need a true-false statement. If that statement evaluates to true, the filter function will keep that item in the new array. If it evaluates to false, it will get rid of that item. So let's wire this up so that this method can take in, what I'm thinking is ID, right? Because we've gotten data from a database. Those IDs should always be unique if the API was not designed correctly. So if we can filter out by ID, we can just remove that particular GIF object from our array. Then we can set state. Then we'll have our data ready to set state again. So great ideas, though, with other ways to approach them for sure. So I think the first thing I want to do is set it up so we can capture the ID. So there's this other part of the documentation, and we'll just look through it a little bit together. Once you get past that first section, it talks about passing arguments to event handlers. Now, this is a little bit tricky in React. It's not as easy as it is in vanilla, or not as obvious, right? Unfortunately, we can't, down in GIF, just call this method exactly and pass it like gif.id, or however we get that information. We can't just do it quite like that. But what we can do, if we check out the documentation, it gives you a couple options right here. So if we want to pass extra parameter, right, that's what we want. We don't just want to capture the event. We want to capture some additional information as well and send it back up, essentially, so that we can use it. These two lines, as they say, the above two lines are equivalent. We see dot bind popping its head up again. Really, this is sort of like a pick your poison situation. I think I'm going to do it this top way because I think that the order of events makes a little more sense there. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this for like reference, and I encourage you to do this until you feel fully comfortable with the syntax. So we're trying to recreate something like this. And what's going on here, we'll go back to the docs, is that we have the onClick event or the function that we want to call is essentially being wrapped in an anonymous function that captures the event. So we'll get access to the event through this, and then we can also pass additional stuff. So let's modify what we have. First thing, we need to make this a function. And then we can capture the event inside of here. And now that it's wrapped in a function, we do actually want to invoke delete GIF, because now it's in a code block where it can actually be called. And let's see what happens if we just declare the event here as the first one. I think this is going to work the same. I'm going to do a hard refresh to make sure we're up to date. And now, if I click, actually, I'm not getting anything happening. So let's see what happens if we pass it the number 4 and then the event. I'm just doing like some placeholder data because in their example, they have the argument that you're passing going first. So let's see what we get now. Oh, wait. Well, we didn't see anything because I removed the console logs, obviously. Okay. Let's go back. So throw another console log of the event, and then we'll go back down to GIF.js, and let's just pass it the event. Let's see what we get now. That was silly. All right, come on. All right, cool. We're back where we started, essentially. We're still capturing the event, but now we're set up a little nicer to actually pass some data to this function. So we can go back here, and then, as I said, I think the ID makes the most sense to filter by because it should always be unique within this array. And it so happens, if we check GIF list, that we actually are passing the ID. We're using it as the key, right? But it is coming through as part of props. So we could just reuse that key. Another thing we could do, and this is going to make it more clear, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it this way. Well, let's just pass another prop called GIF ID and set that equal to GIF.id as well. So this is a little bit redundant, but it makes it very clear in our code what we're doing. It makes it more clear in our code. We want our code to be nice and readable. So we add the ID into the GIF component, and then now in GIF.js, we have access to it through props. So we have the GIF URL that we're using. We also have props.gifid. And now, when we call this function, we can pass it, props.gifid. And if we go back up to app.js, we should be able to log that ID out now. So if we change the console log to ID, let's get back to our app, do a hard refresh. Cool. Now we've got actual ID numbers logging out. 7. Oh, I skipped a few. Okay. Cool. So we have IDs now being received by this method. Now we can go ahead and construct that filter function. So I like to store results in variables of like any higher order functions like mapping, filtering, etc. You don't strictly have to do it this way, but again, I prefer a little bit more code that makes it a little clearer what's happening. So let's do const or let's say modified GIFs or filtered GIFs. That's a much better word. Filtered GIFs equals, and then this dot, well, we have our current GIFs already. Current GIFs dot filter, and this will be a function of a single GIF at a time, a single GIF object, and filter function, we need to return a true/false value. So if we return, what do we want? We want the opposite of GIF.id, right? The current item in the loop's ID. Not equal to the ID that we're receiving in. Not equal ID. And this, it might be more clear if we call this GIF ID as well. Get rid of the console log because that'll break it. So this is the GIF ID that's coming from the component. We're kind of, again, shadowing the names that we're using as part of props to make it a little more clear what's happening. So this should filter them out, and let's log filtered GIFs just to see if our function is working as we think it should. Check it after this refresh. Come on. And looks like it's not filtering anything. Well, I haven't changed state at all yet. What am I missing in my logic here? I think that's an extra not. Yeah. Oh. Okay, we console log, let's log GIF ID here. Part of the return? Right here? Yeah, it's a blue, well, I have a return right here. You do need it. All higher order functions need to return something. Well, yes, true, but that's a syntactic thing. It's still returning. Let's try this again. Okay, there we go. Now we're removing one each time. Well, we're not actually removing it yet, right? Let's see. If we click on the first one, we open it up. Yeah, I had a double negative in there. So we've now removed the first element from the array. Cool. So if we click on the last one, we open that up. Hello? And we should see ID 10 isn't there. Yeah, nice. Cool. There's the logic. Awesome. So now that we have these filtered GIFs, we can actually set state. So we can call our set state function. And this is what we did all that work to bind this properly for. So we can use this.setState and actually modify the current we're in. And we'll set GIFs equal to filtered GIFs. And let's clean this up a little bit. Get rid of the console log here. We can leave the event.prevent default because it's a good practice. So each time we click on one of these child GIFs, you know, a couple layers nested in our component hierarchy, we should see one actually being removed from our list. So hard refresh to make sure we've got the latest code here. And now if we click this GIF, it disappears from the page. And our number of GIFs updates as well. So we can keep clicking, remove as many as we want. Also, the data isn't persistent, so if at any point you want the GIFs back, you can just refresh and you'll get them all again. But now we've got this really clean, really responsive delete functionality. You can imagine maybe there's like a delete button, which perhaps we'll add. And we have things wired up so that we've got different parts of our application that are depending on the same state. And since they're wired up right, our counter can update properly in almost real time, just as the GIFs are actually being deleted from the list. Sweet. So let's check our README again. We just worked on attaching event handlers to JSX elements. Let's add in there, use fat arrow syntax to pass arguments. And let's put a note, can use .bind to pass arguments as well. And then real quick, and we'll pick this up at the beginning of tomorrow, I want to discuss a little bit about where to control state and why. Just the quick hits. We've talked about it a little bit already, but now we actually have an app where multiple components are depending on the same state. This is where state starts to become super, super important, right? So in the hierarchy, app.js loads the data, that gives us the GIFs. Then it passes all the GIFs to GIFList. GIFList maps through, renders out an image for each GIF with the right URL. And we also have this method delete GIFs that we've passed down to GIFList that, passes it all the way to GIF as well. We also have a component over here called GIF. Right now, up until this point, we've been splitting up state, but none of it's really been dependent on the other, right? So in GIF count, we now have a value, a property. And in fact, if we go to app.js, we can look in our render where we're rendering GIF count. That's coming from state. It's coming from the app.js state. The beauty of having things wired up nicely like this is that we can trigger a method, right? We can trigger delete GIF all the way down in this component, which then actually modifies the state of app.js, which means GIFList receives a new list. We render different numbers of GIFs based on that list, and our counter can update basically in real time. As far as the user is concerned, right, it's updating in real time. So our setState function modifies state on app.js, And then React does all the heavy lifting to pass new data to different parts of the application. So if you have state controlled as much as possible in one place, you can then pass that anywhere, and any components that rely on it, whenever it changes, they change as well. This is sort of the essence in terms of architecture of front-end frameworks, is we have all these different components, but they're mostly, and there are exceptions like forms, which we'll get into, but they're mostly dependent on this one source, single source of truth, if you've heard that phrase, or this kind of one state to rule them all, if you will. And no matter how complex our application grows, as long as the data that all the different pieces of it are relying on is controlled in one place, or as much as possible in few places, then our components can basically communicate with each other. So if you think about like Gmail and the toolbars up at the top, that when you click select it, select all, it changes all of your email to selected, or you hit delete, or you check a box in the list of emails and then you hit delete on the toolbar. That's communication between components. Gmail is a huge part of like eventually popularizing front-end frameworks, and it's because it was such a slick user interface and user experience. Like remember those clunky old email clients that we used to have to work with, like Outlook and other programs like that? First of all, we got an application on the web so we could access it anywhere, and it behaved basically like a desktop application, and in some ways better. But we don't have a project in the current curriculum, but in the older curriculum, one of the projects was recreating the Gmail inbox. It was sort of how you proved that you knew front-end frameworks. And it was a really interesting learning experience to see, like, it was really interesting to see, like, oh my God, this is, granted you're building a small portion of it, but like this is how real good apps in the wild work, right? We split everything into these components. We wire it up architecturally so our components can talk to each other. And then we just worry about data. We control the flow of data. We control the spread of data. And when we update the data, the front-end framework does all this heavy lifting for us. So that takes us to about time. I want to continue this discussion or conversation about the architecture and kind of talk a little bit more about where to control state and why. Maybe do some whiteboarding with it next time. But does anyone have questions? We did kind of a lot today, and I felt like it was more me talking and showing than you doing. But do you have questions on some of the wiring that we did and writing methods, passing methods around? Yeah, I'll Slack out the code. I'm going to get the video and the code up and out by the end of the day, for sure. And if you have other questions, or if you want or need some time to think about it, we'll pick up again tomorrow. Probably get into doing forms and making a form to add a new GIF to the page. But come with questions, because I want to pick up this discussion and dive into it a little deeper tomorrow. And maybe we'll do some practice whiteboarding out the hierarchy rather than me just kind of showing it as this static thing. Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, guys.